independent British film companies. Its very name became synonymous with horror and cornered the market in werewolves, demons, zombies and vampires. A host of stars now recall the famous house style of Hammer, the studio that dripped blood.
As a person who waited in line to see a movie or paid at the box office and went at the time, I was in my early teens or about 11 or 12 years old and then into my teenage, went with groups of friends to go see certain films. If we saw the logo of Hammer Films, we knew that it was a very special picture, and we knew it was a certain kind of film. A surprising experience, usually, and shocking.
In May 1957, a British horror film called The Curse of Frankenstein opened in London. It was to make international stars of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing.
There came a time when I saw they were doing Frankenstein, a remake after 25 years' absence from the screen. And I remember seeing the original with Colin Clive and Boris Karloff, and remember it was absolutely wonderful. So I knew there was a break coming in my television work, and I said, what about doing this? It would be a nice one to have a try at. Hammer Films were making 5 pictures a year, and Frankenstein was just one amongst 5, and no one had any idea it would become the incredible success that it was.
A film company, Hammer Films, was looking for a very tall, very big man. And I think they'd learned that I'd done a lot of mime and things like that in the theatre in the preceding 10 years, and they wanted somebody who could play a part without speaking, and who was tall and who was big. So for the first time in my career as an actor, these two elements helped me rather than hindered me.
Costing under £70,000, The Curse of Frankenstein was an overnight success and made Hammer a household name. Its producer was Anthony Hines.
Hammer was my father, surprisingly enough. He was a successful businessman and a failed comedian. He failed because he wasn't really very funny. But he and another chap did a double act years ago, a comic double act. And because my father's business was centered in Hammersmith, they called themselves Hammer and Smith, and the name Hammer started from that. And he went into financing films before the war. I don't know why, because he hated films. Then during the war, a mutual friend introduced him to someone called Enrique Carreras, who was involved in cinema exhibition and distribution. And together they formed a company called Exclusive Films, which just distributed little short films. And after the war, Enrique's son, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carreras, came back and joined the firm. And I went to see him, and we seemed to get on right. And he said, why didn't I join? And I'd just come out of the Air Force, and I really hadn't anything to do. So we got together, and I joined the firm. And it was then just a distribution company. It was handling other people's films. But you have to realize that after the war, there's a tremendous audience for a cinema-going audience in England. People would go, they didn't even bother to find out what was on, they just went. If it was terrible, they came out disappointed. If it was good, they came out, but they still went. So anything went. And there was a tremendous boom in film distribution. The trouble was to try and get the films. A chap came along, and we bought the rights of Dick Barton's Special Agent from the BBC. And he said he'd make this for us for a price. Unfortunately, he didn't think that it entailed his actually remaining in the country, and we got a postcard from Capri saying good luck. And I was left holding the can, so that's how I was thrown in at the deep end.
Hammer thrived on adapting popular BBC radio series such as PC-49 and The Lyons Family. They also produced mystery thrillers and suspense dramas, often with imported American stars to guarantee money from across the Atlantic. Then, in 1953, a BBC television serial proved an enormous hit with the public.
I saw the first episode of Quatermass on BBC television. I was terribly impressed, and I saw my partner next day and said, watch the second episode, because this is good stuff. He saw it, agreed with me. And we went down to the BBC, and we made a deal that they accepted. I think it was, we split 50-50. I mean, it was straightforward. They were better than anybody else had offered. And that's how we started doing the Quatermass films.
From out of this world it came, a horrifying terror that threatened mankind, haunting and possessing every human being within range. An indestructible danger beyond all earthly understanding.
I watched him die a few hours ago in that plant. His whole body covered with some kind of corrosive poisoning, eaten away.
It poisoned everything it touched. The mind and the body of man was no longer in his control. They ran from this unknown menace, but there was no escape.
With the success of Quatermass, Hammer had discovered an eager audience for the revival of a celebrated movie monster.
An American, I can't remember his name, came to my partner with the idea of remaking Frankenstein. But he wanted a lot of money for it, I think. He was going to be involved and wanted a lot of money. And my partner told me this, and I pointed out to him that since Mary Shelley had written it, over 100 years ago, it was hardly in any form of copyright. It was in public domain and nobody owned it. So he went back and saw the American. The next thing I know, the deal had been settled, obviously much better terms, and we're to make Frankenstein, at least I am. And I'm given a script, which I didn't really like. It was rather boring, and it's a sort of rehash of the old. But anyway, we were going to do it. And then, to my secret delight, my partner's horror, we found that Universal were waiting with a writ behind their backs. Because if we put in anything that was in their film that wasn't in the original book or wasn't original of ours, they'd have served an injunction and the film would have been banned. So we had to make a film that was entirely different from the first one. Well, then it became fun.
Fun for the producer, perhaps, but not so much for one of the stars.
The makeup was quite horrendous, is now the word for it, and it was very much hit and miss between myself and the makeup men concerned, because we were not allowed to copy the universal makeup that Boris Karloff wore because of the question of copyright. So I really looked, as somebody quite rightly said, like a road accident. It was also excessively uncomfortable, and it was almost impossible for me to eat or drink, and naturally there weren't many people prepared to sit down and eat and drink with me.
This thing must be destroyed before it regains consciousness. Do you hear me, Victor?
What, Paul? What did you say?
You must destroy this thing now.
Paul, don't you see? I've succeeded.
Succeeded, yes, nearly succeeded in getting yourself killed. Another 10 seconds and you would have
This is my creation.
It seemed that when we saw Curse of Frankenstein, there was a graphic quality to it that was totally uncalled for, which made it extremely endearing to us. We enjoyed it a great deal. And I'll never forget the audience's reaction to that midnight showing at the New York Paramount. They loved it. They loved it. We were about 15 years old, I think, my friends and myself. And then I think the better of the two, of the film that we really felt went further, was the horror of Dracula. You know, there's nothing like the introduction of Dracula in that picture, where he simply walks down the stairs and walks over to Jonathan Harker and says, "Hello, I'm Dracula."
Mr. Harker, I'm glad that you've arrived safely.
Count Dracula.
I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house. I must apologize for not being here to greet you personally, but I trust that you have found everything you needed.
Thank you, sir. It was most thoughtful.
It was the least that I could do after such a journey.
I thought after we'd done the first one, we'd have a complete reshuffle. And I was rather surprised when I was told that I had to have the same people. As a matter of fact, as it worked out, it couldn't have been better. As I say, Cushing had been a star, and I was delighted to have Frank's son. I thought he was excellent in Dracula, and really you couldn't have found a better person than Chris Lee for Dracula, I don't think, anywhere. It was quite original, I think, making him a very presentable, quite sexually attractive, not to me, but quite sexually attractive actor, instead of this rather florid, puffy-faced gentleman, the one associated with
I decided in my own mind, from reading the book, that the author had presented this character as a romantic, erotic, heroic, fascinating figure, highly dangerous, savage, but above all, which I think is the most important thing when you're playing characters of this kind, tormented, agonized, sad. What a ghastly fate to be immortal.
Frankenstein, that was comparatively easy, because there is a chap who was really right ahead of his time. I mean, I think I was the first to start transplanting human organs. The South African doctor did a very much better job of it in about 1968. So therefore, that character wasn't so difficult. The one I found just a little bit more difficult was Van Helsing, because in the book by Bram Stoker, he's described as a very old, little, withered man who speaks almost double Dutch. And this was going back, nearly 25 years, when I was younger and prettier, if that's possible. And so when I was offered the part, I said, well, instead of making me up, I think we'd better play it as myself. I think so they agreed to that.
Count Dracula, the propagator of this unspeakable evil, has disappeared. He must be found and destroyed.
The one thing that Dracula didn't like was crucifix. And there were so many times I had to use one that in the end I thought it would become ludicrous. I was rather like a travelling salesman in crucifix eye. So right at the end of the picture, Van Helsing forces Dracula into a shaft of sunlight by rushing along, pulling some curtains down, and whereupon he withdrew yet another crucifix out of his pocket. I said, really, could we not have something different? And I suggested that they had the long refractory table, a candlestick at each end, and I could rush along like a mad thing, leap on the table again, grab one candlestick, rush to the other and grab the other, then boing them together. And it worked, because it made quite a jolly good climax. And I believe they used the end of that picture in the second Dracula, which I wasn't in for some reason.
Another important member of the Hammer production team was James Carreras' son, Michael.
It was like a dam bursting. There was all over the world a complete readiness for that type of entertainment to be revitalized. And of course, coming back in color, it just caused a sensation.
Too sensational for the critics, who reacted with almost universal contempt. But the public queued up all over the world, and Hammer became the leading producers of traditional horror. They wasted little time in bringing the formidable Victor Frankenstein back from the dead.
In the year 1806, I, Baron Frankenstein, was sentenced to death on the guillotine. But I have escaped the guillotine, and I shall avenge the death of my creation.
They asked me to do a second Frankenstein, for which there was no story. I had to come up with the original story. And I tried to think of something which really frightened me, upset me personally, revolted me, actually. And that's when I wrote the business about the monster that created et people, because I have a fear of being eaten by anybody.
In the 50s, at Bray, by the River Thames, a converted country house called Down Place became the centre of production for Hammer. Among the team they assembled, there was Jimmy Sangster, who began as a production assistant.
Originally, when I went to Bray, in fact, we were making pictures next door at a place called Oakley Court. And we needed more space, so we went next door to Bray, which was just then just a house. And we started using a room at a time. And then we built the stages. And it was always a very good atmosphere. I mean, it really was a family. I mean, everybody was working there sort of permanently, which, let's face it, is very unusual in this industry for anybody to be working permanently at anything. And this is before we did started doing the Gothic horror films. We were doing 8 or 9 pictures a year. Small crew, and it was a good time,
This unique film shows a day at Bray Studios in 1952, with the staff bus arriving from London. The film was Man Trap, a murder mystery typical of Hammer's output of the time. Though working within very tight budgets, Hammer succeeded in disguising their limited resources and creating a distinctive look to their films. For this, they relied on a regular team of technicians, such as camera operator Len Harris, James Needs, editor on all the major Hammer films and responsible for many of the classic shock sequences. Producer Michael Carreras chats to the star of the film, Hollywood actor Paul Henreid. Terence Fisher, the most respected of Hammer directors and the man who was to put Frankenstein and Dracula back on the screen.
Everybody who worked for Hammer loved what they were doing, or quite honestly, often the situation was such, you know, we didn't have enormous budgets, we worked very long hours in very cramped facilities. It was only a big old house. And we did remarkable things. If you look at the old films, the old horror films that were made in that old house, it's quite remarkable. You'd think we'd shot at MGM or Pinewood.
Dinah!
The courtyard, where Dracula made his exit, is still the main entrance to Bray Studios. Every inch of space was used, as shown by this scene from Dick Turpin, Highwayman, made in 1956. Hazel Court, lead actress in The Curse of Frankenstein, is among the images of the 50s still on the wall of the carpenter's shop. Hammer left in 1967, but fantasy worlds are still created here, mainly for commercials and rock videos. The original generator room, though still in use, is curiously reminiscent of Frankenstein's laboratory. Now a luxury hotel, Oakley Court next door was still used in the 60s by Hammer as an atmospheric location.
I can remember shooting in a big room downstairs. I can't remember what film it was. And there wasn't room for the boom operator. And he had to stand outside the window with a boom through the window. And if it rained, it was too bad, he chucked a tarpaulin over himself. And that's how we filmed. And at the time, we didn't think it was extraordinary at all.
I think what people really love about Hammer is the fact that they created a series of other worlds. That's what was strange about it. It was a fantasy factory. I like to think of a year like 1960 in this building behind us, where you started off as Transylvania, with the Brides of Dracula. Then it became a Huguenot settlement for the pirates of Blood River. Then you had good old Sherwood Forest for the Sword of Sherwood Forest. Then it became Spain, the Curse of the Werewolf. I may have missed a couple out.
This was the first of many Gothic horrors to be scripted by Anthony Hines under the pseudonym John Elder, and posed an unusual problem for him.
My partner's son, Michael Carreras, who was also producing, he was going to do a film about the Spanish Inquisition. And he'd already started building the sets when he got a tip from the Catholic office here that they ban it if he did. At least I think that's the story. You know, and all I know is I was landed with a set of Spanish sets.
Bernard Robinson, Hammer's resident art director, was the man responsible for those Spanish sets.
Bernard Robinson, in particular, I would single out. He made tiny sets look quite roomy, and he made medium-sized sets look huge. He had a sort of genius for making the most of everything here. And as you can see, there isn't that much in Bray that would immediately strike one as exotic. And yet he used everything, and he made it work.
Bernard Robinson was art director for certainly all the original horror films. Very, very clever man in making a lot out of not very much. The only trouble was, after we'd been making them a while, I was asked if we could cut down, make them a bit cheaper. I was always being asked that. I said, there's one way we can make them back to back. That is to say, we do a picture, same cast, same sets, and do 2 pictures. And we did a Dracula, I can't remember what it's called, but it ends up with him being chased across the ice.
It's too late, Kate! Get away from there! It's too late!
Why did you shoot him?
It will do no good, my dear. Running water.
Then did a picture about Rasputin, who in fact dies by being dropped into the river Neva, whatever it is, and the ice and drowning. Had the same cast in both. Chris Lee played both Dracula and Rasputin. All the people were the same.
4 films were made back-to-back. On release, Rasputin formed an unholy alliance with the reptile, while Dracula was resurrected with the plague of the zombies. Already an experienced hand with vampires and pirates for Hammer, one of the directors of those 4 films was Don Sharp.
I think it's probably the best thing Christopher Lee's ever done. Rasputin was supposed to have had this ability to hypnotize people. Well, Chris practically developed that ability. It was an incredible performance. They had decided to do 4 pictures together. The big exterior sets that Bernie Robinson had built could be revamped from one picture to another. But the first couple had gone a bit over budget. 2 weeks into the shooting of my Rasputin, Tony Hines came to me and said, "Don, we're in trouble. We've got to save money. Now, we've worked out possible savings. There's this way of doing it, and this way, and this way. Each of those would save $25,000. Look at these suggestions, take them home, think about them over the weekend, but on Monday morning, I want a decision from you." But this was the marvelous thing. He left it to me to decide which would do the least damage in telling the story. He left it to me to say, all right, we can keep that sequence, but we don't have to build that set for it. I can put it into a set we've already used.
This cooperative spirit helped Hammer to flourish at Bray and create their house style. One of its distinctive elements was the music of James Bernard.
I've always taken the title of a film and to see whether that actual title gives me an idea for a tune, which it often does. And Dracula was a case in point. All the Hammer fans know this only too well, but it is just saying Dracula. Dracula. Terence Fisher, the great Hammer director, he was always so charming and gentle. You would never guess, there's no doubt you know, that he was a director of horror films. And he just used to always appear to be very pleased with the results. He said, I trust you to do it. And the only director I worked with who was rather fussy, but it was very interesting working with him, was Joseph Losey. the great Joseph Losey, where, of course, he directed The Damned for Hammer, which was very interesting for me and a different thing altogether. He was terribly fussy at the recording and wanted things changed. And sometimes we just did a little thing just to make him feel that it had been changed. I remember once we were doing some little section of music, and there was something he couldn't quite explain what it was that he didn't like. But I suggested going to the piano and sort of plinking on the string, doing something like that on the string. And I went and did that while the section of music was being recorded. He said, "That's it, that's what I want." But I don't think you heard those plink-plonks on the piano strings at all. But he was the only director I've worked with who was kind of fussy, or seemed to be.
Hammer's roster of distinguished directors included Seth Holt, John Gilling, Freddie Francis, and Terence Fisher.
Hammer were amazingly fortunate to have Terence Fisher standing by, ready to take the whole Gothic revival on his shoulders. He was particularly useful in that he took the material seriously and solemnly, but he didn't try and jazz it up. He was, I think, a sort of English gentleman in the Conan Doyle storyteller tradition.
Right, action. He was such a dear, kind, cuddly little man. Very shy. He had been an excellent editor, which is very helpful to any film director, because they can help with the economy of film, because he knows exactly where he wants to cut the picture, so you don't get yards and yards of footage that will never be used. He did a great deal of homework, which was frightfully important. In film, particularly when your schedule is such a short, I mean, 3 weeks isn't a great deal of time to do a 1.5-hour film. He didn't have time, no director would have, to give every actor 100% of his time what they had to do. So it's up to the individual actor to do his own homework. And often you'll suggest a thing to Teddy, and he'll either say, "Ah, dear boy, that is a very good idea, and we will do so and so," and elaborate upon it. Or he'll say, "No, because I don't think you do that because of this." So it was one of those tremendous team things that happened.
We used to have a lot of laughs. And whenever he gave me a close-up, I used to make a point of walking up to him, putting a fiver into his hand. And we did it in such a way, because he was a pretty good actor too, that the unit really believed that I bribed him for a close-up every time I did it, until they caught on. It was a kind of a joke between us. He was a great arranger. He'd say, "Okay, show me what you should do, and then I'll tell you if it's right or wrong." And he knew what he was doing, believe me.
The headquarters of Hammer were located in Soho, in an office block, proudly named Hammer House. In command of the business operation was Lieutenant Colonel Sir James Carreras.
He was the governor. Very rarely saw him. I mean, I saw him because I used to work up at the office between pictures. But I think the entire time I was at Hammer, which on and off was about 15 years, I think he came to the studios maybe 6 times. I don't think he was particularly interested in me. It wasn't that he wasn't interested. I think it used to upset him to come down and see 30 people standing around, at least 28 of them appearing to do absolutely nothing at all, and he was having to pay them every week. And he wasn't a production man, so I think they used to upset him. But he was the governor, and any success that Hammer had was due to him.
Without Jimmy Carreras, there would have been no Hammer, in my opinion. He was preeminent amongst many equals. he had a quality which we don't find these days, and which I may say we desperately need in the British film industry. He was, quite simply, a showman, a very great showman, an entrepreneur. He knew what to give the public. He knew how to present it to them, how to market it. He knew exactly what kind of film they apparently wanted to see, and he gave it to them.
I think it's all come about by the fact that we start with a title. We think to ourselves, what's a good title? And we think, To Love a Vampire. And so then we make a poster. And with this poster, I go around and see these distributors and say to them, how would you like to have a picture called To Love a Vampire? And they say, wonderful, when can I have it? So I say, well, perhaps we can deliver it in about 6 months' time. And I say, you want to see a script, or do you want to know who's in it? And they say, no, don't bother about that. This is a Hammer film, and we know it'll be all right.
I remember going to America with him, first time I ever went, in 1958, for the premiere of the first Dracula in New York. It was quite an occasion, I can tell you, to say the least, at midnight. And I remember him saying, it was on my birthday, and they gave a party for me in a New York restaurant, and they produced an enormous cake, so I thought, well, I know how they expect me to cut this cake, so I went zoom, straight like that with a knife. And he said, whatever you want, gentlemen, just tell me. He said, if you want Strauss waltzes, we'll make them.
How many heart transplants today?
Hearts? James, they're old-fashioned. We're on brains now.
Are you?
Yes.
Jimmy Carreras was sitting next to me at the dinner table. And I said, Ian, you will have a job for me, now won't you? And he said, yeah, why don't you come and see me at 10 in the morning? So I said, yeah, right. He said, you better go to bed so you look halfway decent. And I did, and everybody laughed, and everybody thought I was mad. But I immediately left and went to bed. Crazy woman. And I went to see him the next morning. And I remember Maxi Fashion had just come into vogue. And I had this black gear on. And I went into his office and I said, Colonel Sir, Lieutenant Pitt reporting for duty, sir. And he laughed. And that was the beginning of a wonderful working relationship. It's really good. The first memory is very funny, actually, because I walked onto the set the first day of my shooting. And Peter Cushing was in the process of decapitating me. And I don't know, it made me swallow. It was quite funny when he stabbed her and pulled her up and slashed her head off and held this head up high. And I thought, oh, that's me. And I remember showing the photograph of it to my mother, and she laughed, and I thought, funny mother.
As Carmilla, a bisexual vampire, Ingrid Pitt created a new lead character.
The fangs kept falling out, and they kept falling into Kate O'Mara's cleavage, and the crew wanted to help retrieve them.
Ingrid Pitt proved to be the most enduring of Hammer's discoveries, as they eagerly promoted female stars with the box office trend towards more sex and nudity. Others came and went, such as the Collinson twins from Malta, former Miss Norway, Julie Edge, and Danish Jutta Stensgaard. She was asked about her hopes after playing a vampire.
I think to become known as an extremely good actress. And I hope to get an Oscar sometime.
Despite her Scandinavian looks, Veronica Carlson hailed from closer to home, York, in fact.
What a lovely piece of export.
It was export that won Hammer the Queen's Award for Industry in 1968. 3 years later, with Anthony Hines and Sir James in retirement, the company was taken over by Michael Carreras.
Inside Michael was another kind of producer trying to get out, and I think Michael had a lot more ambition for Hammer Produce and wanted to go very much further.
Carreras' plans for Hammer were indeed wider-reaching than the Gothic horrors. He'd moved from producing to writing and directing. Hammer diversified in the 60s with psychological thrillers, including Taste of Fear, Paranoiac with a young Oliver Reed, and The Nanny with veteran star Betty Davis.
You mustn't make it difficult for Nanny, Master Joey. Master Joey, such a silly thing to do.
Michael Carreras' real preference was for such exotic adventures as 1 Million Years BC, Hammer's greatest moneymaker, and Rider Haggard's She.
You are aware of my orders, that all strangers are to be brought unharmed to me. You disobeyed these orders. You prepared to sacrifice one of these strangers. I am she who must be obeyed. There is only one penalty for those who do not choose to obey. A lesson in obedience. Teach them.
How far do you think we'd get?
Don't forget, sir, they were going to take a knife and fork to Mr. Lear.
A number of Hammer's more outlandish and bizarre projects failed to reach the screen. A brief flirtation with Kung Fu proved less than happy, and Hammer returned to their old standby, spin-offs from popular television series.
I think they went wrong when Tony Hines left, because I don't think anybody could replace Tony Hines with that same understanding of the basic plots that would adapt to the genre. I don't think anybody else had the same sympathy, the same feeling for quality. Other producers took over, but they were copies. They didn't have that original inspiration that he had. To me, Tony Hines was Hammer.
I stopped making them in 1971 because, in my opinion, the presentation of the character had deteriorated to such an extent, particularly bringing him into the contemporary day and age, that it no longer had any meaning. And the problem was, and I said this at the time, that a story was written and then somebody said, well, where shall we put the character in at precise moments? And it got to a point where I was only required to appear from time to time from a dark corner or something like that and do very little else.
I think the spring ran dry on Dracula and Frankenstein years ago. Now, I know they keep coming back and making cod Draculas, but I don't think you could turn around now and remake Dracula or remake Frankenstein, because I think the whole thing has been really done to death.
I think a moment came to an end. Sir James left, retired. I think the moment came to an end. You know, there was a time and then there wasn't a time.
The reason for Hammer's decline, the one that's usually supplied, is the fact that The Exorcist came along and the major studios got in on the act. I think that's true up to a point. It's perfectly fair to say that major studios threw a lot of money at the kind of genre subjects that Hammer were doing, but I think it's only true up to a point. The fact is that Hammer were making the wrong films at the wrong time in the 70s. They should have been making Night of the Living Dead. They should have been making Halloween. They should have been trying to find a Cronenberg or a Carpenter. If they'd found that low-budget formula, they could have gone on for another decade. There was one chance, a film called The Devil Rides Out, very good film, which anticipated Rosemary's Baby in a way. That could have taken off, could have been a series. If Hammer had just got hold of a series, it would have saved them.
We must get them out of here. Them. Tanith, too. Tanith is her real name. This is her baptism as well. Very well, we'll do what we can.
Goat of Ventis. The devil himself.
What we did was to create a morality play. It was a fairy story. It really was fantasy. It was magic. People knew it couldn't really happen. What they do today can happen, does happen, and will go on happening, and that's why I'm against it. And that's why I haven't made a film like this for so many years.
All age groups, from what I hear verbally and by mail, they loved those films because although they frightened them, scared them, gave them a lovely scare, like on the roller coaster, you know, going screaming down, but knowing you'll come safely up the other side, and your boyfriend puts his arm round your shoulder to protect you. They were never, what was the word they used? They were frightened, but they weren't repelled.